In Ukraine, the combination of drone technologies with long-range precision weapons has made the battlefield an increasingly dangerous place for valuable targets. You can imagine a scenario where a Russian drone operator flies their Orlan deep behind Ukrainian lines, spots something valuable, like a HIMARS or a Patriot launcher, in all their low-resolution glory, and within minutes, a multi-million-dollar Iskander ballistic missile is flying towards the target, only for, moments later, the drone operator's mood to rapidly deflate, along with the target, as it becomes clear the rocket hasn't destroyed an American missile system, and instead someone's going to have to explain to command why they just slammed a ballistic missile into a militarised jumping castle, in this case, straight out of the Czech Republic. As Ukraine has struggled to get access to enough air defence systems and air defence munitions to fend off Russian missile and air attacks, we've seen a lot of Ukrainian and some Russian attempts to augment real defences with a lot of fake targets, diverting precision munitions onto decoys made of everything from wood to foam to scrap metal and old satellite dishes. The use of military decoys is far from a new phenomenon, but it's arguably taken on new importance on Ukraine's transparent battlefield. Because if you exist on a battlefield where everyone can more or less see everything, the best defence may be to make sure the opponent can no longer trust what they see. And so today, it's time to look at military decoys and the role they've played in Ukraine. We'll start with some history on how some militaries have used decoys in the past, as well as some more recent theory on them. What are they meant to do, what makes a good one, and how are they meant to fit into wider battle plans? Then we'll have a more detailed look at decoys in the war in Ukraine specifically, both in terms of how the Ukrainians and the Russians have been using them. As we work through those use cases, we'll examine some of the various types of decoys we've seen, from the very, very basic to advanced systems capable of fooling various sensors and moving under their own power. Then, towards the end, we'll zoom out and start asking what all of this might mean for other militaries, including the potential value and effectiveness of decoys in the context of near-peer, large-scale combat operations, ever-improving sensor networks, and munition limitations. But before we jump into that, a quick word from a sponsor. When it comes to major international events, there's usually no shortage of coverage. But with so much coming out so quickly, it might be useful to have a tool that helps you get a fuller picture and more balanced perspective. Ground News strives to be exactly that sort of tool, a website and app that gathers related articles from more than 50,000 sources around the world to potentially help you better assess how a given story is being covered. Sometimes the difference in headlines are going to be dramatic, and other times more subtle. For example, with these stories covering the ongoing Russian offensive towards Pokrovsk in Ukraine, one headline focuses on official evacuation efforts and the broader context of Russian advances, while the next omits some of that, instead putting forward a rough timeline for civilian evacuation. Using the tool in this way might give you a cross-section of the way a story is being covered quickly. You'll be able to identify differences in what information is elevated to the headline, as well as, with all stories on the platform, an assessment of the ownership structure and political lean of the sources reporting, backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. Beyond that function, I also like to highlight features like the blind spot feed, because what it tries to do is show you stories that are being disproportionately covered by some sources, but not others. And what that might help do is boost your awareness by showing you what's being covered by sources you normally might not consume. None of this is a perfect answer to problems like echo chambers and distorted coverage, but it is a tool that might help, and a reason why I'm happy to have Ground News supporting the channel. So if you are interested, you can go to ground.news/Perun or use the link in the video description. That link will get you 40% off their Vantage plan, which gives unlimited access to all the Ground News features. And so, with my thanks to Ground News as always, let's get back to it. Now, we'll start as we often do with a bit of history, although a little less than normal because some historical examples we included through the rest of the presentation. For basically as long as warfare has been a thing, it appears there have been leaders who recognise the potential value of using all sorts of sneaky tricks to deceive your opponent. In his famous work The Art of War, Sun Tzu suggested that ultimately all war is based on deception, and emphasised the potential value of appearing weak where you're strong and strong where you're weak. Being millennia removed from the modern battlefield, he wouldn't have had access to things like mechanised decoys or signature emitters, but based on the writings, I think we can be reasonably confident that he'd be a fan. One key tool in the practice of military deception, and the one we're focused on today, has always been the decoy. Mock-ups and deception tools that have, across history, allowed commanders to at various times fake just about everything, from fake artillery pieces that are actually just painted logs like the one you see on the right there, to, in some more extreme cases, faking the presence of entire armies. Perhaps one of the most famous and extreme historical examples there is the so-called Ghost Army of World War II. This was the product of a World War II US Army deception unit, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They brought together visual deception experts, many of whom were artists or came from show business, who worked with tools like inflatable dummy tanks, inflatable jeeps, inflatable trucks, fake airfields, you name it. Those armies of inflatables were then given a very real sonic and radio presence through the use of things like phony radio traffic, as well as, on multiple occasions, camouflage that was just good enough to be credible, but just bad enough to be seen through by opposing air reconnaissance. While this probably served as a funny example of grown-up theatre kids living their best lives while deceiving the Axis war machine, this was far from the only example of the craft. All major combatants during World War II are believed to have employed decoys extensively, although it's fair to say that on numerous occasions, the Brits and the Soviets really leaned into it. In this Soviet piece, written in the mid-1970s, the authors reflect on some of the decoy techniques used by the Red Army during the Second World War. To give one example, quote, "Organising and improving the defence, the troops often established a false forward edge, which extended 1 to 1.5 kilometres from the real one. Dummies were placed in the trenches, and machine gun positions were rigged up. Specially detached troops periodically conducted fire. The goal of creating a false forward edge was to force the enemy to conduct artillery and air preparation in vain while going over to the offensive. It's very important to note that even as sensor technology continued to improve over the course of the 20th century, decoying remained prevalent, particularly in a number of cases where it was heavily leveraged by forces that found themselves in the distinctly unenviable position of opposing the US and various Allied air forces. Serbian forces in the 1990s, for example, made extensive use of decoying. You can see one particularly high-tech example on the right there, in an attempt to not be bombed back to the Paleolithic by NATO air power. If you want a slightly higher fidelity example than a passenger car with a log stuck through the window, here's a mock-up MiG-29 from the same decade. As much as you might want to laugh at decoys like that when you have access to a close-up static image, remember these were being used to counter a bombing campaign, not a ground assault. And for NATO pilots, the difference was sometimes hard to tell. In 2019, Dr. Phil Haun wrote a piece on the air campaign in Kosovo. He's now a professor at the US Navy War College, but at the time, he was an experienced A-10 pilot. And regarding his experience in A-10s during Kosovo, he made the following observations. The Serbs, like many armies, deployed decoys as part of their tactics. The use of decoys did not make the Serbian army exceptional, nor were NATO airmen necessarily naive for striking them. At medium altitude, it is difficult to discern a decoy from a valid target. So how, might you ask, did these Allied air forces, with all of their advanced technology, deal with the problem posed by some particularly creative Serbian carpenters? Part of the answer, it seems, was to just use more bomb. To quote our former A-10 pilot, "The method often employed was not to be overly concerned about differentiating between the two, but to strike any targets located. If the target disappeared when struck, it was likely a decoy. The point is that when targets are rare and weapons plentiful, it is preferable to waste some bombs on decoys rather than allow valid targets to escape." In that sense, I'd argue the Serbian example is an argument both for and against the general effectiveness of decoys against a modern opponent. Some Serbian figures claimed that the decoys had done their job and basically neutralised NATO air power. Pavkovic, one of the relevant Serbian army generals, declared that his forces had only lost 13 tanks, 6 armoured personnel carriers and 27 artillery pieces to NATO bombing. But then again, Pavkovic also claimed to have shot down 47 NATO aircraft, which is the kind of claim that convinces me that him and Konashenkov would probably get along just fine. After the campaign wound up, NATO undertook an exercise to try and validate just how much damage had actually been done by the airstrikes versus what had been claimed. The result was that of roughly 2,000 claimed hits by NATO pilots on mobile Serbian targets, they were reportedly able to validate about half as striking genuine targets. The decoys did apparently draw some fire, but never on a scale that was going to run NATO out of bombs. That said, in the 21st century, decoys have continued to see wide-scale use in conflict, especially by forces that find themselves matched up against an opponent with a significant advantage in firepower. And so with the historical stage somewhat set, it's probably time to dig a little bit deeper into decoys themselves and the logic behind their use. Open a military manual and you'll find all sorts of definitions as to what a decoy is. For example, FM 3-13.4, which was a US Army piece on military deception, helpfully sets out that, quote, "A decoy is an imitation in any sense of a person, object or phenomenon that is intended to deceive enemy surveillance devices or mislead enemy evaluation." Put another way, it's a thing that looks like something else. Usually, I'd add, without being as expensive or complex as the thing being imitated. The key point here is that when we say looks like, we mean that very holistically, not just in terms of what you can see with your eyes. The manner in which you're trying to replicate a target might be different based on what sort of sensors or group of sensors you're expecting to have to deceive. If you look at the American manned air launch decoy, for example, which you can see on screen there, it's believed that some versions of that system are capable of tricking some opposing radar systems into recognising them as different American jets. It doesn't really matter that the malled itself doesn't physically look like a jet, because the sensor you're trying to fool is a long-distance radar. And while a blow-up tank might have all sorts of utility on the ground, I doubt an inflatable F-15 is going to have much in the way of aerodynamic virtues. Why would you use a decoy? Well, the glib answer would be to convince your opponent that something is there that isn't, but the wider answer is that it's a tool to confuse your opponent. And while there is a whole range of reasons you might want to induce confusion, one of the most common, and one that we're going to encounter a lot when we talk about Ukrainian examples a little bit later on, is that it can be used as a force protection technique. To quote from one US manual, the goal is to divert enemy resources into reporting or engaging false targets. An enemy who has mistakenly identified decoys as real targets is less inclined to search harder for the actual well-hidden targets. This is one area where, arguably, sometimes the natural human inclination to believe what we want to believe can come into it. If Private Conscriptovich has been told there is a major cash bounty for any destroyed HIMARS systems, for example, when he spots something that looks kind of like a HIMARS through the potato optics on his drone, maybe he's going to favour the interpretation that lets him call in an expensive missile strike and then get paid, rather than the one that requires him to look just that little bit closer. Human frailties and follies aside, however, militaries have identified a couple of elements that go into making a good decoy. The first is how realistic the decoy is, often referred to as decoy fidelity. Because your opponent might be using more than just simple visual sensors, fidelity is about more than just how your decoy looks. In fact, depending on the circumstances, how your decoy looks may not actually be that important. Decoys have essentially had to evolve to match new types of sensors that have been developed and fielded. And as a result, you may see definitions like this one. Decoy fidelity refers to how closely the multispectral decoy signature represents the target signature. For example, the ADM-141 tactical air-launched decoys, which you can see on the right there, were used extensively during Desert Storm and were equipped with passive and active radar enhancers, essentially the opposite of stealth features. To Iraqi air defences that obviously couldn't go out and physically look at the things, these appeared on scope as American aircraft. In part, that was then intended to bait them into activating their air defence radars to fend off the imaginary air attack, only to be destroyed by a very real air attack in the form of anti-radiation HARM missiles. In that sort of scenario, the fidelity of an ADM-141 decoy has very little to do with its visual or thermal signature, and almost everything to do with its radar signature. So if you think of military decoys as operating against various parts of the spectrum, I'd also argue they operate kind of on a spectrum, specifically an extremely wide spectrum when it comes to relative cost and quality. At one end, you can have decoys that are designed to be as cheap, simple, and easy to mass produce as possible, even if that means they're not going to fool a particularly advanced sensor system or even an opponent who takes a particularly close look. As examples on our right there, I have our Serbian MiG-29 from earlier, as well as a stick-armed mannequin from the war in Ukraine. Ken, the conscript mannequin dressed in a garbage bag and armed with a stick, probably isn't going to fool a thermal sensor, for example, but it might fool a tired soldier taking a quick glance at a distance, and it's very, very cheap. At the other end of the spectrum, you can see purpose-designed, factory-built decoy systems that can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Some of the decoys being used by the Ukrainians in Ukraine, for example, are fully motorised, so they're mobile under their own power, and are designed to be able to replicate the thermal and other electromagnetic emissions of the system they are trying to impersonate. This is still obviously going to be much, much cheaper and easier to manufacture than the equipment that's being duplicated, but the cost and level of multispectral fidelity is obviously going to be much, much higher than mannequin in a poncho. And if you're looking for a definitive answer on which approach is better, cheap low fidelity or expensive high fidelity, the answer is probably it depends. Those fake cannon on the right there, sometimes referred to as Quaker guns from the US Civil War, this one dated 1862, probably wouldn't represent a useful level of fidelity on a modern drone-saturated battlefield. Even through the camera of a very basic DJI Mavic, a log is going to look like a log. But in an era where scouts were still relying on the Mark I eyeball as their dominant sensor with some optical assistance, it's more likely there were cases where this would have been good enough. The other element that manuals will often point to when talking about effective decoy use is how they're used. Again, there's an element of how humans think to be leveraged here, and it's that we tend to be less critical in analysing things that we see as typical. If you see a wealthy celebrity on TV wearing a Rolex, you might err towards believing that it's genuine. But if you see a bloke rolling out of cash converters with 6 of them, you might have doubts. That same broad principle can apply in a military context when it comes to decoy location. To quote again from one of the manuals, deployment location refers to whether or not a decoy is deployed so the enemy will recognise it as typical for that target type. For example, a decoy tank is not properly located if it is placed in the middle of a lake. End quote. Now, obviously there are some problems with that statement, given the Ukrainian context. Tanks in lakes, or especially rivers, is something we've seen on a number of occasions over the course of the fighting there, but we'll probably give the manuals a pass here, as replicating the Seversky Donetsk river crossing scene using decoys is a pretty niche application, and most of them were written before the invasion anyway. The key point here is that location and broader context can add a lot to the potential effectiveness of any decoy. During World War I, for example, when Anzac forces were withdrawing from Gallipoli, they used a variety of relatively simple decoy and deception measures to convince the Turks that they were still there, even when they were in the process of evacuating. What you can see on the right there is a so-called drip rifle, which has been set up with a basic water timer so that after a period of time, the rifle will go off. You can imagine that opposing infantry in a trench warfare scenario are probably going to spend relatively less time sticking their head above the trench in order to have a close look at your lines, if they happen to hear and perceive a pretty consistent pattern of gunfire coming in their general direction. Put more clinically, if you have a context which partially disables or degrades the opponent's senses, you might be able to get away with decoy and deception efforts that otherwise wouldn't work. The American Ghost Army would set up scenes like this, where they would drive genuine vehicles around to leave a bunch of tracks, and then set up the inflatables on top of them to make the scene more believable than if the inflatables were just sitting there without any tracks or supporting evidence. The key is to cause an opponent to perceive something that they expect to perceive, which brings us from some of that theory to how we've seen decoys be used in the war in Ukraine. And here I'm going to break this up by talking about some of the Ukrainian usage first, and then having a look at the Russians. There are arguably some basic, first principles-driven reasons that Ukraine has been drawn to the use of decoys even before the current invasion began. Ukraine is opposed by a force that has a significant advantage in things like long-range precision fires, air power, and artillery. And without enough countermeasures of its own, think things like aircraft or air defense systems to take those Russian threats off the board, there's a lot of incentive in place to use decoys and other passive defense measures instead. If you can't stop the Russians shooting at you, the logic might go, at least you might convince them to shoot at something that isn't important. To that end, we saw a surge of often relatively simple decoys used in the earliest phases of the 2022 invasion. The image you see on the right there, for example, is reportedly of a Ukrainian trench that was staffed with resolute defenders who stood firm against every threat against them, not even taking cover when the Russian artillery started raining down, presumably in part because they were made of plastic. Mannequins taken from shops were quickly repurposed into infantry decoys and reportedly used in attempts to confuse Russian scouts, draw Russian fire, or give the impression that positions were better defended than they actually were. Here, for example, you have a man-pads operator, in inverted commas, made out of some basic military equipment, something which might potentially cause an emotional event and some evasive maneuvers for any helicopter pilot that spotted this out of the corner of their eye, but which probably wouldn't pose that much of an actual threat, given, among other things, its lack of fingers. Here again, from the same May 2022 thread, you have an image of a basic fighting position in Mykolaiv, staffed again with mannequin infantry, who apparently lacked the connections the previous guy had because these guys didn't even get issued uniforms. At the moment, it appears that a common thread across a lot of these early, rapidly pulled-together deception attempts is that the decoys involved were relatively basic. These are ad hoc efforts that appear to have often been thrown together with materials that happen to be on hand, and often, as you can see on the right there and in those previous images, the fidelity level in general was relatively low. None of these examples would fool a thermal imager, or indeed someone with some decent optics, taking a look for more than 2 seconds. And yet we have evidence that appears to show at least some of these decoys drawing Russian indirect fire. And so I'd tentatively suggest that part of the reason some of this stuff may have worked in 2022, yet we don't see much of it now in 2024, is that point we discussed earlier about location and context mattering. In 2024, the battlefield is sensor-saturated, movements are relatively slow, and drone operators and reconnaissance elements on both sides are pretty across what they expect to see or not see. But the earliest phases of the special military operation were, to put it politely, a relatively dynamic environment, which is a polite way of saying that in a lot of places it was a complete flustercluck, and a lot of the troops involved had absolutely no clue what was going on or what they should expect to see. But as the war has gone on, I think, at least in open source, we've seen a shift away from these kinds of efforts towards those that are more focused either on defeating specific Russian threats or protecting specialised equipment. For example, no matter how skillful Ukrainian pilots are or how low they fly during their sorties, there's always going to be one place where they're vulnerable to Russian long-range fires: on the ground, at their airfields. Here, a typical method of defence against less responsive long-range fires, say the combination of Russian reconnaissance satellites with cruise missiles, is simply to relocate aircraft all the time. If it takes ages to identify a target and launch a strike, just make sure an aircraft doesn't spend ages in one spot. That's less practical when the threat is potentially much more responsive. An Iskander missile spotted for by a reconnaissance drone might only provide a couple of minutes warning, and at shorter distances, systems like Lancet might be used instead. The one redeeming feature here that will come up again and again as we go through Ukrainian examples is that while Iskander missiles are very dangerous, very accurate and very responsive, they're also very expensive and comparatively few in number. The production rate for Iskander-M ballistic missiles was estimated at about 30 per month in the latter part of 2023, and while pricing is fairly difficult in the current Russian circumstances, 7 figures per missile in US dollar terms wouldn't be unreasonable. On average then, you'd expect the Russians to have the capacity to fire 1 to 2 missiles per day across the entire front. What you can see there on the right there is imagery taken during a Lancet, not Iskander attack against a Ukrainian forward airbase in November 2023. At longer ranges, this sort of target might be assigned an Iskander, but this was within the range of the extended range versions of the Lancet munitions that we saw appearing in greater numbers around this time. On the face of it, this might appear to be an open and shut case of some combination of bad luck and military incompetence. A Russian drone identifies the expensive Ukrainian Sukhoi 25 attack jet, and the Lancet does the rest. Except there's every reason to believe that that isn't a Sukhoi 25. And I say that for various reasons, including the fact that the engines are in the wrong place. On an actual Sukhoi 25, like the one you see on the left there, the engine is blended into the wing form. With our Wish.com version on the right, the engine is suspended under the wing. From a distance, or apparently to a Russian drone operator with a close-up view, this might not look like too much of a difference. But in engineering and recognition terms, it's very much a don't pass go, don't collect $200 error. We can certainly hypothesize why a decoy might look that way. One explanation might be that things like the wings and engines were produced separately and then just joined together. But whyever it was done, I think we can be cautiously confident that this and other cases like it represent new examples of that modern military classic, precision weapon meets arts and crafts project. When it comes to protecting active Ukrainian aircraft, one interesting technique that sort of blurs the line between what is and isn't a decoy is the use of retired or inactive airframes. Ukraine inherited a lot more aircraft from the Soviet Union than it was able to maintain and currently operates. Indeed, at one point, Ukraine operated strategic bombers before it was encouraged to decommission them. Some of those airframes may have had value as parts donors, for example, keeping the rest of the fleet alive through constant transplants. But pre-invasion, Ukrainian air bases were home to dozens of these things, actively looking for a purpose. Some of them do appear to have eventually been repaired and reactivated, but others made their final contribution to the Ukrainian war effort by eating Russian missile strikes. Particularly in the opening days of the war, Russian missile strikes targeted Ukrainian air bases, and we saw a significant number of airframes destroyed or damaged. It can be difficult to prove for certain whether any of the aircraft destroyed in those strikes were inactive or retired, but one key tell can be when satellite imagery indicates that the aircraft involved haven't moved in many, many years. The image you see on the right there is of the Ukrainian Sukhoi 25 Blue 42 destroyed in a missile strike 24 February 2022. It was very clearly hit and destroyed, along with, among other things, another Sukhoi 25. Both presumably made their way into the Russian claims data, but both were reportedly retired airframes that had been stored in place for years. That doesn't mean they were without value, but certainly less valuable than active operational aircraft, and the jury's probably out in terms of how they compare in value to the salvo of missiles fired against them and the opportunity cost of not firing those same missiles against something else. One key potential advantage of using older inactive airframes as decoys is that they're going to be able to mimic the multispectral signature of the thing they're trying to impersonate relatively well, considering that's what they are. A drone operator might be able to see the aircraft on the ground through his camera, but I doubt anyone's going to be sticking the maintenance logs to the inside of the canopy just to make life easier for them. The disadvantages, of course, is they're probably going to be heavier and harder to maneuver than things like inflatables, but you do get that added fidelity. It's already been theorised by a number of analysts that along with its operational F-16s, Ukraine will also be receiving some old junkers. Older, aged-out F-16 airframes, stripped of anything valuable, ready to play their potential role, catching Iskander missiles and keeping the Russians guessing. In a sense, the benefit here is at least threefold. Firstly, it denies the Russians an easy read on where the F-16s are being based and what part of the front may receive a visit from them next. Secondly, they potentially divert and draw fire. And thirdly, they might potentially degrade confidence and help gunk up the Russian kill chain. If a drone operator spots what appears to be an F-16 on the ground in a scenario where they know that decoys are currently active, they really have two options. You can wait and try and verify whether the thing in question is a decoy or not. There are a couple of different ways you might go about doing that. But if you're wrong and it isn't a decoy, you run the risk of it taking off, moving or relocating, and you missing the chance to engage it. Alternatively, you embrace that NATO 1990s approach, task a weapon anyway, just in case, and thus run the risk of expending most of the entire front's daily quota of TBMs against a prop. Given that Ukraine's F-16s are likely to be pretty high up Russia's most wanted list when it comes to targeting, we should probably also expect to see more conventional decoying as well. And yes, before you ask, inflatable F-16 decoys are absolutely a thing. Here's one which, as a complete coincidence I'm sure, is carrying Ukrainian markings. Of course, Ukraine's aircraft aren't the only priority targets for Russian long-range precision fires. Air defence systems have to be pretty up there as well. Western manufactured air defence systems in particular are in very short supply, very capable, and absolutely critical to defending Ukrainian airspace against Russian aircraft and missile strikes. As we explained in the recent episode on air defences in Ukraine, if Ukraine's GBAD losses ever became too great, it's possible the VKS would be able to start flying missions into Ukrainian airspace itself, rather than largely relying on standoff tactics. The Russians know that would be ruinous for Ukraine, the Ukrainians know that would be ruinous for Ukraine, and so time and again, we've seen examples of Ukraine's limited inventory of very real Western air defence systems, augmented by some not-so-real ones. Some of these decoys have been so good that debate continues over whether or not they were actually decoys, and we'll get to the question of recognition in a moment. Here's a view from a Russian Lancet, reportedly tracking in on a wooden IRIS-D decoy under a camo net, with the camo net, I'd comment, being an interesting layer in the deception exercise. Covering something in a camo net might mean you're able to get away with a little less fidelity in the decoy itself. Small errors in detail might be literally covered up by the net draped over the thing. But at the same time, its presence might not be unusual enough to set any alarm bells ringing. These IRIS-T launchers are valuable systems. It makes sense that the Ukrainians would try to camouflage them wherever possible. And indeed, as a lot of the manuals I looked through seem to suggest, it might actually be more suspicious if a piece of valuable equipment like this was just left out in the open, uncamouflaged, almost inviting an opponent to engage it. You know, like these two objects, claimed as the text suggests by the Russians to be Patriot launchers, that were just sitting out in the open, stationed closely together and pushed right up against the ocean near Odessa, where they were subsequently engaged by what appear to be Russian Iskanders. Again, it's impossible to absolutely 100% prove anything, but the Ukrainians did claim that these two units were decoys, and I think a lot of contextual evidence supports that claim. While our sample of high-quality footage of strikes on these objects, complete with an aftermath to enable an assessment as to whether something was a decoy or not, is relatively limited, it does seem that a lot of these decoys sit somewhere in the middle of the fidelity and cost spectrum. They're not hastily repurposed mannequins with drainpipe rocket launchers, but at the same time they're not dedicated factory-built multispectral decoys. Instead, we're seeing a lot of quite good, often wooden mock-ups manufactured in Ukraine itself in order to help protect the actual equipment. You can, for example, see a fake radar being produced on the right there. Wooden decoys obviously aren't going to emit in the same way an actual radar does, but then again, when a radar's turned off, it doesn't emit either. And good luck manufacturing cruise missiles or even good loitering munitions more cheaply than something a couple of blokes could throw together in the backyard after a short trip to Bunnings. The challenge for us as observers is how then do we recognise these decoys after footage of strikes comes out? Remembering that Russia is obviously going to have an incentive to claim that every struck target is real, while Ukraine probably has a couple of incentives to claim the opposite. There are a couple of tells you can look for if you're reviewing drone footage, although strategic cuts and low quality can sometimes get in the way. A target that wobbles or deflates after being struck is probably an inflatable. If you see something burning that very much shouldn't be, say the exterior of a gun barrel, you might be dealing with something made of timber rather than metal. But one of the biggest clues people can look for is the presence or absence of secondary detonations. This is especially true with certain air defence systems where you can physically see the load of missiles and know that it's not just running with an empty ammunition load. It might surprise you to hear that missiles tend to be chock full of lots of very, very explosive and flammable things. And so if a target explodes in spectacular fashion after being cleanly hit, that's a pretty good clue it might be genuine. There are also a range of specific visual cues you might want to look for specific vehicle types, but for now we'll stick to some basic rules of thumb rather than turning the entire episode into a NATO and Soviet equipment recognition guide. I'd also note that the defence of air defence systems is an area where we've seen another type of decoy be used. Or rather, one where we believe a certain sort of decoy has been used even if the visual evidence is relatively lacking. Several reports suggest that some time ago at this point, the United States sent Ukraine a number of Joint Threat Emitters, or JTEs. The JTE, and you can see one of them on the right there, isn't a dedicated decoy system, it's actually primarily marketed as a training aid. You can put these things out on a training range, and they will mimic the signatures of a whole range of potential threats so pilots can train in detecting and engaging them. The Northrop Grumman tagline for this particular piece of equipment is, quote, "The threats are simulated, your reactions won't be." Basically, while the system can't hurt you directly, In terms of its emissions, this thing is a mimic. It's Mystique. It is the ditto of air defence systems. And it can help address a challenge that many NATO and allied air forces are going to face. They don't have access to an infinite supply of opposition air defence radar systems to train against, nor the budget to acquire them. So instead, something like the JTE comes with, quote, advanced threat emulation capability, end quote, and can do a decent job on the training range of emulating whatever sort of bad guy you need it to be. The observation then is that there's no reason threat emulation should only be possible on the training range. In the field, going off Northrop Grumman's materials, a standard TU unit could pump out the signals associated with up to 6 different air defence systems. Add to that a single command unit can control up to 12 of those systems at once, and suddenly you have a package that, while not cheap, could mimic parts of a larger air defence system with multi-tiers of threats, basically all by itself. How exactly Ukraine might be using these systems is not widely discussed, and so I don't want to dig into it too much here. Moving away from super high-end equipment though, where even the decoys may be comparatively expensive, before we move on, I think it's also worth noting that we've seen Ukraine make extensive use of decoys in one of the most important elements of the war in Ukraine, the artillery war. Compared to a lot of other countries its size, Ukraine has a relatively large supply of workshops, factories, and individuals with trade skills. And while there are a lot of facilities out there that can't produce functional military equipment from scratch, they've apparently absolutely got you covered if you ever want to LARP as an artillery unit. What you're seeing on the right there are 2 decoy artillery systems, one of Soviet make and the other the famous M777, with the latter reportedly being a particular favourite of some decoy makers. When talking about Russian claims of Ukrainian losses in the past, I've talked about the apparent overclaiming problem. That particularly when it comes to certain high-profile Western systems like M777 or HIMARS, Russian claims are so high that if they were true, Ukraine would have nothing left. Part of that may just be the simple result of overclaiming. In other cases, because systems claimed destroyed are in fact repaired and put back into service. But it's interesting to ask whether decoys like this might be playing a role in Russian overclaiming as well. The Russians blap a couple of decoy M777s, and then no one in the system has any incentive to ask whether or not the target was actually legitimate. Whether it's because the individuals involved want to be paid a bounty, receive a promotion, a slap on the back, or just be able to provide the boss with some good news, there are probably a lot of figures in the Russian military who don't have much incentive to look too closely after a munition has struck the target and the video has been cut off. We've also seen decoys of even lower level equipment be manufactured and used at a tactical level. On the right there you have some decoy mortar systems, and on the top some Stugna anti-tank guided missiles. The mortars on the right there are literally, I believe, some basic piping combined with non-functional repurposed satellite dishes. The economic benefit here might not be as extreme because mortars are just incredibly cheap as it is, but it's still interesting to note that we have visual evidence of this sort of thing being done. But perhaps the most high-profile example of decoy-driven deception at this level has been the imitation of HIMARS and M270. While not as effective now as when they were first introduced due to a series of Russian adaptations, HIMARS and M270 have continued to be a significant thorn in Russia's side. GIMLRS and ATACMS missiles have become very valuable tools for the Ukrainian military, and quite understandably, Russia has focused a lot of attention, effort, and munitions on hunting them. On the flip side, while systems have been lost and mistakes have been made, the Ukrainians also appear to have put a lot of effort into protecting these systems, both through exploiting their mobility and also the use of decoys. The images you see on the right there, for example, relate to a recent claimed Russian destruction of an M270 by an Iskander ballistic missile. Some reports indicate that what may have happened is the Russians located an actual Ukrainian M270 which fired a number of missiles, lost track of it, reacquired in inverted commas a nearby decoy, and then engaged that. Looking closely at the strike footage and some of the comparators that I've included here, you can see why many might suspect this would be a decoy. In many respects, the thing looks like an inflatable, albeit a good inflatable decoy. We've seen a number of these kinds of decoys in Ukraine, and they match a type that's produced by a Czech company, Inflatech, that advertise a range of military vehicle imitation systems that might set you back very low 5-figure sum per unit. A key point about these decoys, though, which might go some way towards explaining why the Russians might be lured into striking them, is that, contrary to appearances, these things are not just HIMARS or M270-shaped jumping castles with a camo colour scheme. If you look through a thermal camera at some of these decoys, you will see the thermal signature of a real vehicle. They're designed to be as high fidelity as possible while remaining cheap to a variety of sensors, and they're also self-propelled. There's sometimes actually a little drive unit under the inflatable that allows operators to drive these things by remote control. That might help relocating the system or potentially providing a sense of urgency to anyone attempting to target it. If you see a potentially dubious target driving towards cover in a tree line, for example, you might not spend as much time closely examining it before deciding to pull the trigger. Think of this as militarized FOMO, or the false urgency often induced by scam artists. Convince a human that they're going to miss out on some fantastic opportunity if they don't act right this second, and all of a sudden they're sending money to strangers, buying the next scam coin, and blasting apart Czech inflatables with valuable ordnance. There's a broader observation I want to make here about rocket artillery systems, some air defense systems, anything that follows this basic design model. There are a lot of very expensive, very dangerous, high-priority targets out there that basically come down to being a truck with some sort of payload and a whole bunch of expensive stuff stuffed inside said truck. The truck itself is not the expensive part of HIMARS, it's the missiles and everything that goes into allowing the vehicle to fire them. What that means is that systems like this can potentially be quite easy to produce high-fidelity decoys for. You just take preferably the same, or at the very least very similar model of truck, slap a decoy weapon pod on the back, and congratulations, you now have HIMARS at home. That approach obviously isn't perfect, but if you're trying to protect a limited supply of the real thing, divert a lot of opposing ISR assets, and potentially draw fire, it's probably going to be considerably easier to produce a very high-fidelity decoy HIMARS than it is a decoy Abrams. There are two final elements I want to flag here before we move on and start talking about the Russians. The first is an extension on that story of the M270 decoy we just discussed, where apparently a real system was originally spotted, but then attention drawn onto a decoy. If nothing else, I think that example serves to highlight the potential value of operating decoy and real systems in relatively close proximity, supporting each other. If you are only using decoy systems on a given part of the battlefield, the chances might be higher that your opponent recognises them as such because there's no evidence of the real systems being present. M777 decoys but no 155mm artillery shelling, or HIMARS decoys but a noticeable absence of localised tungsten showers, then that may be grounds for your opponent to be more suspicious and to look a little more closely. But if you have decoys and the real deal operating closer together, things might be different. A real HIMARS might fire off some missiles and then displace, but when the reconnaissance drone arrives and sees the decoy, you might increase the odds that the operator feels they're seeing exactly what they expect to see. A rocket artillery system in the place the rockets came from. You can imagine how you might achieve something similar with all different kinds of equipment and very different types of signature. In that sense, going all in on one or the other, the real or the fake, might be less efficient than effectively combining and integrating the two. The other point, I think, is that it's important not to overstate just how effective this sort of stuff is, and to emphasise it's not any kind of silver bullet. A lot of decoys are probably recognised for what they are, rather than catching PGMs. They're not free to transport or utilise, and it's abundantly clear that a lot of very real equipment is still being found, hit and destroyed, despite decoy efforts. The thing is, it demonstrably works some of the time. Decoy manufacturers are doing a roaring trade right now, and the advantage arguably comes not from the fact that it's perfectly reliable as a tactic, but rather that it is just so affordable and accessible compared to just piling up more actual equipment and tanking the losses. When the cost differences involved are measured in orders of magnitude, you don't need that high a success rate to make it worth trying. So alright, we've talked about the Ukrainians. What about the Russians when it comes to decoys? It's probably hard to come up with a military situation where decoys wouldn't be useful, but it is worth understanding the Russians face a slightly different dynamic in Ukraine than the Ukrainians do. In the Ukrainians, the Russians have an opponent that have access to a much lower volume of fire, but at the same time, arguably in a lot of cases, better sensors, better intelligence, and better precision. The Ukrainians are obviously going to benefit, for example, from whatever intelligence is shared by their various allies and the sensor systems they control, as well as secondary sources that can get high-fidelity reconnaissance done, like friendly civilians operating in Russian-occupied territory, or at least occasionally, Russian civilians in those occupied territories as well. Ukraine also places comparatively more reliance on relatively inexpensive precision fire options. FPVs are probably the most salient example, but Ukraine also has a much reduced supply of expensive systems like air-launched cruise missiles and TBMs, and a greater reliance on things like Gimler's rockets that, while still more than $100,000 each, don't stretch into seven figures the way things like Iskander probably do. The final element worth noting up front is that in most cases Ukraine is going to be on the defence in Ukraine, not attacking, which might reduce the utility from the Russian perspective of setting up things like the fake Ukrainian defensive positions that we talked about earlier. That said, the Russian military maintains a long tradition of military deception, has specialised troops for the task, and there have been reports of specialised units like the 45th Separate Camouflage Engineer Regiment operating in Ukraine with their famous inflatable decoys. Now, obviously, in most of the cases we're aware of, the decoy was identified as such by drone operators prior to drawing much in the way of fire. But it's very, very difficult to estimate how many other cases there might be where the decoy wasn't recognised as such until after it had drawn valuable Ukrainian fire. But for the purpose of this episode, I think the most interesting element of Russian decoy efforts that I want to focus on actually relates to the long-range strike campaign, where the potential goal, in some ways mirroring Ukraine's efforts to shield its aircraft from long-range Russian attacks, has been to protect things like Russian airbases from long-range Ukrainian one-way attack drones. We talked a little bit about Ukraine's counter-air campaign using these drones a couple of episodes ago. But since that point, there's been another wave of strikes, and the costs have appeared to mount. Examination of the imagery that came out after the attack on the Marinovka airbase suggested a grand total, according to Oryx estimates, of 1 Sukhoi 34 destroyed, 2 damaged, another unknown jet damaged, including significant damage to airfield infrastructure, including ammunition storage, obviously meaning that ordnance will now not be available to drop on Ukrainian targets. However you look at that, it's a pretty big oof, considering the systems that were involved in the attack. If that had been something like stealthy cruise or ballistic missiles that provided much less warning time and didn't allow the rest of the aircraft on base to scramble and get out of there before warheads started raining down, you have to imagine the damage could have been much, much greater. A question for the Russians then might be how to potentially try and deal with or at least mitigate the damage caused by these strikes without just spamming more air defense systems around every single airbase. We've seen them come up with a variety of responses, with basic decoys being among them. And as far as decoys go, I'd argue you probably don't get any simpler than what you see on the right there, literally just painting fake airplanes on the ground at your various airbases. You can see another example of this particularly two-dimensional decoy technique on the right there, with what appears to be the outline of a Tupolev 95 painted at one of Russia's airbases for its strategic bombers. Those have been a critical part of Russia's ongoing missile campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure, and so as you can imagine, are rare, valuable priority targets for Ukrainian long-range systems. That said, trying to figure out what the Russians are attempting to achieve with these sort of efforts probably requires a little bit of speculation. In terms of the types of systems that this sort of effort might fool, modern military reconnaissance satellites are probably just out from the get-go. Any sort of optical sensor with sufficient resolution is probably going to laugh at this sort of attempt, as will things like synthetic aperture radar, which will key operators in pretty quickly to the fact that this thing does not actually rise off the ground. Anything with a thermal camera is going to ignore this, as is any weapon system that is dependent on GPS or inertial navigation in order to handle its guidance. To my mind, that suggests these efforts probably have a relatively narrow range of targets, for example, relatively low-resolution commercial satellite imagery that might not be able to tell the difference. Think the really fuzzy stuff that channels that 1990s era internet feeling, and which might be available online for free or for cheap, covering various states. That still might not help you if, for example, you get the size of the pretend aircraft wrong, but I can see a potential use case there. Another possibility is if you think Ukrainian long-range attack drones might be using very basic image recognition in order to find their targets, maybe you think they might be confused by this sort of thing and are willing to give it a shot. Then there are a whole range of other potential explanations that might have very little to do with whether it works or not. Or maybe someone sufficiently important had a bit of a thought balloon moment, and now everyone's being told to do it. Like I said, the explanation is mostly a matter of conjecture, but it's certainly a recurring theme. It also appears the Russian Navy has been trying to get in on the action too. Earlier this month, for example, it was reported the Russians appeared to have set up a decoy submarine in Crimea. Here, there are probably some issues with decoy fidelity, given that people on the internet were able to tell the difference using the available imagery, but there is a potential logic here, and it's hard to know how many decoys aren't successfully identified. Russia's supply of cruise missiles and TBMs is limited, but Ukraine's is much, much more so. And so if a decoy attempt is able to draw out some of that limited Ukrainian supply, it might be well worth it. Not this one though. This one almost certainly didn't work. A broader observation here is that we have seen Russia repeatedly try to take advantage of things like decoys and camouflage, but some of their usage, as well as the way that Ukrainians have gone about it, has also served to demonstrate some of the limitations of decoys in general. Namely that there are some very believable, attractive targets out there that are difficult or impossible to create believable decoys for. A lot of Ukraine's favoured targets for its long-range attack drones, for example, appear to fall into a couple of categories. Static infrastructure like hangars and ammunition storage at established Russian air bases, energy storage facilities, energy refinery facilities, industrial facilities, larger ammunition storages that tend to have a lot of tells on them being there, like a constant necessary stream of logistics traffic in and out, And then if you broaden the weapon set to include things like cruise and ballistic missiles, you can also add things like key bridges, transportation links, and then from the Russian perspective, Ukrainian power plants and energy transmission infrastructure. You'll note that very few of those targets fall into the category of things that would be easy to create a decoy for. A relatively convincing fake tank may only set you back $10,000 and may actually fool someone. But good luck setting up a believable inflatable power plant or bridge, and by the time you set up a paved runway and put up some hangars in order to produce a fake, in inverted commas, airfield, you've gone most of the way towards just building an airfield. Decoys appear to have proven most successful in protecting small, mobile, valuable assets. But when it comes to the kinds of valuable strategic and operational infrastructure that's drawn so much attention in this conflict, the decoys are probably mostly out, and the hard and soft kill defensive systems are in. So looking at these Ukrainian experiences and all these technological developments, what might other nations be taking from all this? On a battlefield saturated with modern technology, might there still be a place for some low-tech trickery? One of the reasons I decided to include a history section earlier was to flag the fact that a lot of Western militaries actually have fairly strong decoy traditions. The US participated in some of the largest scale decoy and deception efforts in history, the UK and Dominions likewise, along with more than a few creative tricks of their own. In the North African campaign, for example, the Brits were able to turn trucks into tanks and tanks into trucks. But while the capacity and focus on things like decoys might still exist to some extent in some of these militaries, you can see an image from Desert Storm on the right there, many NATO or NATO-type militaries have divested their decoy inventories, either in whole or part. Budgets for training, personnel and development often just aren't there the way they are for other, often kinetic systems. And there are a number of factors that might explain that steady shift in focus over time, many of them quite reasonable. For decades at this point, most of these militaries have gotten used to fighting opponents that are very much below that peer or near-peer level. Decoys are often at their most useful as a defensive measure, protecting the actual components of your force. But the Serbs in the 1990s didn't have access to satellite reconnaissance that needed to be fooled. Gaddafi didn't have access to long-range missiles to strike against NATO air bases. In each of those cases, it was just additional ISR and offensive capabilities that probably mattered more. And so fake weapons got shoved further and further down the investment list compared to real ones. There are also, anecdotally, sometimes some more questionable reasons that might push decoys off the wish list. For example, they may not have the same incumbency advantages. There just may not be that many specialists and decoys out there in some militaries to rise through the ranks and then advocate at higher levels, compared to senior officers that came from different backgrounds. Plus, any number of other potential reasons besides. Combat arms already facing recruitment issues, wanting to focus the personnel they do have on things that go boom rather than things that don't, or the perception that in the eyes of politicians or the public, balloon tanks are never going to be as cool as actual tanks. But with many forces in the process of retooling and refocusing themselves away from things like counterinsurgency warfare towards large-scale combat operations, we might start to see more attention be focused on low-tech answers to opponents with high-tech capabilities. There are, of course, some reasons to be cautious about the potential role decoys might play beyond just the Ukrainian context. One of the issues I pretty constantly saw raised in writings on the topic was the challenge of modern sensors and battlefield transparency, and the sort of added demands that might place on decoy fidelity. Simple wooden decoys, for example, probably don't work in a world where thermal cameras are everywhere. And, the thinking goes, if you have sensors out there that can look at everything from the heat of an object to the material it appears to be made of with relative confidence, and then network and share that information relatively seamlessly, then you're probably not going to be able to bait a missile strike by setting up a blow-up doll with a water gun in the window of a building. Instead, you run the risk of these things just being wasted effort. I think those risks are obviously very real and place a greater premium on high-fidelity decoys. But at the same time, I think there are probably at least 3 asterisks that should be raised against the argument that sensors are just too good for decoys to ever be worth investing in. The first is that it may not be safe to assume that in a peer conflict scenario, everyone's sensor networks are fully intact, communicating and networking properly. You might have drones being swept from the sky, anti-satellite weapons being engaged, and electronic warfare operators turning significant parts of the spectrum into a real-life impression of the warp. The demands for satellite time might be immense. You may have a backlog in analysing information that comes in, and even if a lot of that broader system is still intact and largely keeping up with demand, you may still have units or commanders that can't fully access it. That might leave space for decoys that aren't good enough to operate under optimum conditions, but might work well enough under battlefield conditions. And an extension of that is that even if decoys can't always defeat opposing ISR, they might be able to tax it. For example, assume a unit is able to identify something pretty valuable, like an opposing air defense system, using a platoon-level drone. They point the relatively potato optics of their drone at it, and it certainly looks like an air defense missile launcher under a camo net, and in a world where decoys don't exist, that might be good enough. You call it in, someone tasks the TBM, and a couple of minutes later the target evaporates before it has a chance to relocate. But if the thing may or may not be a decoy, you now have a problem. You can take the chance of firing just in case the target's real, but if you want to know for sure, you're going to need more sensors and more time. Maybe you need to get connected to an asset that's a couple of steps up on your basic quad rotor and get it pointed at that target. And if your best sensor platforms are constantly being called on to validate potential targets, they may not be being used effectively for something else. The problem can potentially occur at different echelons and with a whole range of initial detecting sensors. An initial satellite overpass detecting what appears to be a surface-to-air missile site may not be enough. An infantry putting their eyes on a potential target may not be enough. Basically, by introducing doubt through decoys, a force may be able to lift the burden of proof, so to speak, of determining whether or not something is or isn't a target. And even if a target is verified, that state of being may only be temporary. Both legitimate targets and decoys might be able to relocate in a way that makes it very difficult to track them the entire time. Give a team of particularly well-motivated prop artists a couple of trucks full of decoys and a slab or two of Red Bull, and they may have entire armoured formations or squadrons of aircraft popping up and disappearing along the front, like a game of inflatable whack-a-mole. Then there's the argument there are still going to be some cases where even if everything is working perfectly, sensors still can't tell the difference between a decoy and the real thing. A good potential example here probably comes from the PLA's rocket force. We previously covered reports that the PRC is in the process of constructing more than 300 new ICBM silos across multiple fields. However, at least for the moment, there's some fairly strong evidence that China doesn't have missiles for all those silos, and not all of those silos may be real. Some may be fully constructed silos, but without the very valuable missile in place, while others may just be mock-ups intended to fool satellite reconnaissance. The problem, as best as we can tell in open source, is that telling the difference between the three, using just satellite-based sensors, is still incredibly difficult. We've seen the PRC often carries out construction activity on these silos under a temporary tent-like structure that blocks reconnaissance during that construction process. That means that you can see vehicles and personnel entering and leaving the construction site, but you can't tell which silo, if any, the missiles are being installed in, and how much work is actually being done. Then, eventually, the cover is removed, and you're presented with a series of seemingly identical silos that may be vastly different in terms of capability. The potential value there is that competitors may not be able to practically tell the difference between silos that contain a potentially world-ending threat and glorified sandpits with a concrete cap. Thus, if they want to launch a first strike to knock out your nuclear capabilities, they're probably going to have to task warheads against each of those silos, real or not. That maximizes the so-called nuclear sponge function of these ICBM fields, and it has some parallels to the approach proposed in the US during the Cold War of having single ICBMs operate out of multiple shelters linked by a railway network. The methodology was different, but the logic was to some extent the same. Suck up as many opposing warheads as possible, knocking out each of your missiles. But for me, one of the most significant and potentially overriding points here in the context of a potential peer-on-peer or peer-on-near-peer conventional war is that issue of magazine depth. If you go back to that article we looked at earlier about the Serbians using decoys against NATO air power in the 1990s, one general theme you might pick up, which also appeared across a number of other pieces I read on the Kosovo air campaign, is that in the end, the decoys didn't prevent NATO air power accomplishing its mission. As the article put it, the fact that some decoys had been struck or that derelict hulks had been attacked multiple times, quote, proved neither the brilliance of Serbian tactics nor the naivety of NATO airmen. It instead revealed the shortcomings of some analysts who reached broad conclusions over the ineffectiveness of air power based on anecdotal evidence of these individually ineffective airstrikes. But you have to recall that one of the mechanisms NATO was reportedly using to deal with those decoys was to just blast them and the real targets alike, rather than investing too many brain calories in trying to figure out the difference. My basic question then is, how sustainable is that sort of approach likely to be in a future scenario that doesn't match the immediate post-Cold War US Air Force and various allies up against mighty, mighty Serbia? As we've seen in the case of Russia invading Ukraine, there are a huge number of targets on a conventional battlefield that you're likely to want to strike. And Russia has quickly become munition-constrained in its long-range cruise and ballistic missiles, fighting just against Ukraine, to say nothing of a scenario in which they're matched up against NATO as a whole. In the future, forces may just not have the munition budget to strike all of the real targets out there, let alone spare them destroying fake ones. And the risks get even greater when you start talking about very high-end responsive systems that we're starting to see fielded in greater numbers. Iskander is expensive, sure, but in the Asia-Pacific theatre, you're looking at powers planning to fire hypersonic missiles or medium-range ballistic missiles against conventional targets. Hypersonic glide vehicle-equipped systems like the Chinese DF-17 or American Dark Eagle might give you a chance to strike very valuable, fleeting targets, potentially even through the teeth of opposing air defence systems. But they're going to be available with limited numbers, and sometimes with a price point that would make it cheaper to literally fire fourth-generation aircraft at your opponent than the missile in question. And so you're probably going to want to be really, really, really sure as a commander before you decide to pull the trigger on those things. And if decoy, camouflage and deception efforts can convince you either to fire those missiles against fake targets or to hesitate in firing them against real targets because you're worried they might be decoys, then the return on investment mounts very, very quickly. And it may just add insult to injury that a lot of the systems that these premium weapon systems are designed to deal with, often fleeting, valuable targets at very long distances, are often going to be exactly the kind of targets where it's difficult to coordinate multiple sensors to make the differentiation between decoy and real. You might not be able to get reconnaissance drones deep into enemy airspace. You might not be able to task a specialised satellite if you only have a couple of minutes to make a decision on whether to engage or not. And while things like human intelligence might have their place here, choosing to try and phone a friend, so to speak, in the middle of an active war with a very short turnaround time may not do amazing things for the OH&S of the operatives in question. Ultimately, the use of decoys in future warfare, as it is now, is likely to be as much a science as an art. There's the scientific side of trying to maximise fidelity, fool opposing sensors, deny the sensors that you can't fool wherever possible, and all the modelling that goes into things like determining the ideal ratio between decoy and real systems. But at the same time, as we've seen in Ukraine, this is still very much an art as well. It's about understanding decision makers on the other side of the battlefield, how they perceive it, and how they make decisions. It's about understanding when and how the use of a decoy might arouse suspicions, and when it might prompt them to take the bait. And while decoys themselves might be suitable for rapid construction on relatively short notice, that sort of know-how, understanding and experience takes time to develop, as does developing new decoys and concepts for their use. Over time, we should probably expect to see new concepts tested, both in terms of the decoys themselves and how to use them on the battlefield. An inflatable HIMARS may not always be a sufficiently convincing decoy, but a self-driving or remote piloted truck with a fake missile pod may well be. A mannequin in a defensive position may struggle to convince an opponent that it's the real deal. But could the same always be said for a humanoid robot dressed up in some military equipment and given a false heat signature? We don't really know the answer as to what concepts will be developed, tested and found to be effective. But it's worth observing that in the race between sensor and decoy, there's no reason the decoys themselves have to stay still. And going forward, it'll be interesting to see what sort of investments countries make there, as they consider the potential of decoys, camouflage and deception efforts in underpinning future deterrence. In conclusion then, using decoys as a tool of military deception is an ancient tradition, albeit one that's had to evolve as sensors have done the same. The best decoys now often have to be multispectral, with things like heat signatures to avoid being easily differentiated. Even in an environment where sensors have gotten better, more networked and more available, there still, however, might be some value in fielding decoys. We've seen evidence that they can tax opposing ISR, that they can draw engagements, that they can impose challenges on limited magazines. And while they're obviously not a silver bullet and far from always successful, it's hard to move past just how cheap even some of the more advanced decoys can be than the equipment they're trying to imitate. And given that we've seen both Russia and Ukraine attempt to employ decoys, with some evident successes, it'll be interesting to see if some militaries out there take a renewed look at an old concept. And okay, channel update to close out. This one's been on my list for a while because I feel that things like decoy, camouflage and battlefield deception are often discussed less on things like YouTube than the platforms themselves. The problem, of course, is the video evidence base in places like Ukraine might be even more limited than normal here, because if you happen to hit a target and it becomes clear after the fact that it's a decoy, the odds of you actually releasing that footage are not zero, but certainly less than if you hit something that blew up in spectacular fashion. Next week we are likely to return to the Ukrainian topic more broadly, but I wanted to give events there another week to develop, and hence this video. In terms of other updates related to the channel, patrons, something should probably be going up on Tuesday, I expect, in terms of some potential future topics, as well as the results of that charity poll and the first steps I've taken there. While to the Peruvian gaming people, I'm sorry you lost a video last week after the audio went wrong. There should be one coming out Monday or Tuesday as well to get us back on track. As always, my genuine thanks to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement with the channel. Thank you very much to Ground News for their support. I hope you all enjoyed today's video, and that I'll see you all again next week.